Hello and welcome to the special panel on COVIDSafe, Tracing, Surveillance, and Other Organized Irresponsibilities. This event is presented by Deakin University's Global Digital Public Networks, I'll repeat that again, Deakin University's Global Digital Publics Network and the Science and Society Network's Data Cultures theme. My name is Radhika Gurur, and I'm a deputy co-convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network and a co-theme leader of the Data Cultures theme. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us are today. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For those of you who have not attended one of our seminars to date, I'll just give you a quick rundown of the structure of today's event. We have 5 speakers on the panel today. Each of them will present for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of discussion, that is comments from the respondent and Dr. Monique Mann. I will introduce each of the speakers one by one. Just after about 11 a.m. Melbourne time, we'll invite a general discussion of Q&A from the audience. I'll be chairing this discussion here on Zoom, and my colleague Tao Pan will be moderating on the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear your answers, to hear and to answer your questions. So you can either post your questions on the YouTube chat or send it to us on Twitter at SSNDeakin. Make sure you use the hashtags SSN Seminar or email to ssninfo, ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. I'll introduce each of the speakers as we go, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker to you now, Jessica Glenn. Jessica Glenn is the co-CEO of AIM, and she was the first to detail the code of COVIDSafe. She introduces herself as the builder of AI and robots, and sometimes of companies too. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Good morning, everyone. COVIDSafe. COVIDSafe's been a bit of an interesting journey. In April, we were told that there was going to be a new application that was going to come out. It was going to be a layer of contact tracing that, like all things, technology was going to solve all problems. It's totally fine, don't worry about it. Because the government was introducing it, there was significant commentary. A lot of people wanted to know if it was safe to use, if it was going to track your location, if it was some kind of insidious government plot to make sure that we had tags on everyone all the time. That's pretty standard, but it became difficult because a lot of people in tech were adding to that feedback loop. A lot of people who knew really well were concerned. And we were told that the source code would be released alongside the application. So I got some of our team together and I said, what we should do is just look through the source code and see if it says what it does on the box. And that was easy because it was going to be the source code. It would be simple. But when the app was released, obviously that wasn't the case. The source code didn't come with it. And so we went, oh goodness, oh goody, oh golly, let's reverse engineer this. So we did. We reverse engineered the Android app and the iOS application. And we said, okay, well, what's actually in the box? And it was slightly frustrating that they hadn't released the source code because it turned out there wasn't really much insidious in the box. It did what it said it was going to do. There were some bugs, there were some things that could have been done better, but you'd expect that of something that had been rushed out the door. And so we wrote a report, and the intent of our report was to just create something that gave facts to the debate. People were still going to argue whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but we wanted them to have the ammunition to do so from a place of knowledge. We know that worked because I've watched the report that we initially wrote and the subsequent report used to argue both sides of the argument, which is how you tend to know whether you've done a good job. So we did that. We started to give some feedback back into the DTA team. We spoke to the BCG people that were involved and said, hey, here are some things that you could fix. And we were a bit impressed by the iteration speed, given that it was a government project. Generally, they don't iterate that fast. And so that was a good sign. It's a shame that it's gotten to the point where it's not really used. So it does do what it says on the box. It can be effective, and it still hasn't been effective at all. And one of the reasons for that, it appears, is that this federal government project was built very quickly based on technology imported from Singapore, but not in cahoots with the contact tracing teams that actually have to do the work, right? So within Victoria and New South Wales in particular, Victoria doesn't use it at all. They turned around at the beginning of this second wave and said, we're not going to touch that. And that's as we start to come out of the second wave, and as we start to look at QR codes for check-ins and how we do COVID-safe workplaces and check-in there, one of the things that we need to be really careful of doing is keeping an eye on how the data is going to be used, both from a security and privacy point of view, which is really important. And I know that some of the other speakers on the panel are about to speak about that, but also in a how it's going to be used. So if we're going to trade the liberties and the privacy that we do in order to use these technologies, then we need to make sure that the iteration rate is fast, like it has been, but also focused on how that data is going to be used and how it can be effective. We're seeing more and more solutions pop up. We're seeing, I was in Queensland before the second wave popped up, and there were 3 or 4 different QR code providers for you to check into a cafe at the time. When we had to do a COVID-safe plan for our facility down in Melbourne, there were half a dozen vendors contacting us saying, this is how we can make sure that you've got a record. And it's just important that we keep an eye on exactly how we integrate that into a strong approach. So that's, I guess, why we're here, what I can add to the conversation. And I was asked to do about 5 to 10 minutes worth of conversation. So I think that's about 5 to 6 minutes. And I'm going to cut myself off there so that we can get on to Vanessa, who's got some really good insight into exactly how we can improve this from a privacy and security point of view.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'll invite Vanessa Teague now. Vanessa is an associate professor at ANU, and she's also the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity, which brings critical thinking and mathematical insight to cybersecurity problems. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Okay, that was a fascinating introduction. Thank you, Jessica. I am just going to look through what the tech community has found when we looked at the code of COVIDSafe. So basically everything that Jessica said, it doesn't do location tracking. It doesn't do the kind of nasty surveillance based on location that some people were concerned about before we'd seen it. However, I think there are very good reasons to be concerned about its privacy and security properties. So I've been keeping a little list, which I updated last night, and you can go and look at it yourself if you like, of all the different kinds of issues that the open source community has found since the source code for, or indeed since the running code for COVIDSafe was first made available. There's issues, many of them have been corrected, mostly as a result of input from the outside, and they relate to a whole lot of different kinds of things. Some of them relate to being able to track the phone. In other words, if an attacker who has Bluetooth beacons around some kind of public place is able to identify when the same phone has come back past different kinds of beacons and hence figure out whether it's the same person returning. Some of them are actually really serious security problems that allow an attacker to take control of the phone, for example, by persuading the phone that it's a remote keyboard. Now, there's a workaround for that now, and you can look at it on the list. Some of them are, in fact, a very, very large number of them are functionality issues. So things that stopped COVIDSafe from doing just the basic exchange of IDs that it was supposed to be doing in order to work. And as we've looked at it over many months now, we've found a sort of continuing iteration of fixing and breaking, and fixing again and breaking again, just that very basic mechanism of if 2 people are close together for a reasonable amount of time, do their phones, both running COVIDSafe, actually record the IDs necessary to remember the interaction for later if one of them tests positive. We know that that didn't used to work effectively, particularly we know that it didn't work effectively in particular modes between different kinds of phones because of particular bugs at particular times. We know that most of the specific bugs that we've known about have now been fixed. But what we don't really know is whether the thing actually now works effectively. And the data that I would love to see is from the state-based contact tracers, just some kind of careful empirical data gathering that says, when we found Alice and Bob, and we knew that they'd both been running COVIDSafe and we knew that they'd both been within close contact, can we query the COVIDSafe database and just check whether or not COVIDSafe accurately recorded that interaction? So like I said, we know that in the past that wasn't happening effectively. We know there have been a bunch of bug fixes, but we still don't really know whether it's working now. Part of the reason that we don't really know is that we still haven't got the server code, which is very sad. So it's possible that many of the bugs that remain are actually on the server side, given that the app side has now had a very thorough look over by the open community. We have slight hints about bug fixes in the algorithm. So just to be clear, what's happening is that when you test positive for COVID, you upload to an Amazon server the complete list of all of the contacts that your COVIDSafe app has recorded over the last few weeks. And then there's some kind of algorithm on the AWS server, which has never had any kind of public scrutiny and we really don't know anything about, which does some kind of computation to decide who should be notified, i.e. who should be warned that they've been close enough to a infected person. Maybe it's working perfectly, maybe it's not working at all. We really haven't got a clue at the moment. We've had one tiny little hint from the Chief Medical Officer who at one point referred to algorithmic improvements in the detection algorithm, which I think consisted of looking at 15-minute intervals and recognising that even if there hadn't been a consistent presence, a consistent detection of the person through 15 minutes, that in fact the warning should be raised, because especially since the detection is a little bit iffy, you can probably assume that a person who appeared at one point and then reappeared 15 minutes later was actually consistently there through that period. So that's an algorithmic improvement that we've had, to which most people in the tech community basically responded by saying, oh, great, thanks. We were hoping you'd fix those kinds of bugs. So anyway, we know that it didn't used to work very well. We don't have hard data about whether it is working now. Which brings me to my next and somewhat more fundamental point, and I want to share just a slightly different part of my screen. Because of course, this information about whether it's working well, which we don't have, ought to be feeding into a genuine public discussion about whether we should be sticking with this form of architecture or whether we should be ditching it like the UK and most other democratic nations have, and switching over to a decentralized model based on the Google Apple API. Now, I know this has been discussed all over the place. I know I've only got a minute left. I'm not going to talk about it in any great detail, but suffice it to say that most of our concerns about the data gathering in the centralized Amazon database that occur through COVIDSafe would not occur if we switched over to a decentralized design based on the GAPL exposure notification framework. The UK used to have a centralized design a lot like COVIDSafe. They had a much more open, careful, democratic discussion about whether it was working and what they should be doing. They decided to switch. I think we should decide to switch too. Maybe we can talk about it at the panel afterwards. But suffice it to say, what we really need as input into this discussion is some accurate information about how effectively COVIDSafe is doing its basic job right now. And I just want to conclude by saying that there's a very analogous discussion about the venue check-in apps that many of my other panelists discussed on the ABC AM this morning. And we have exactly the same kind of a decision about whether or not we are going to do that in a way that builds either one centralized database or a whole lot of little private companies' centralized databases, or whether we do it in a way that just doesn't build it in the first place. So in Australia, we seem to have decided, without ever having any kind of democratic discussion about it, we seem to have opted for a kind of weird, semi-private, semi-centralized model in which lots of private corporations are gathering centralized databases of where everybody has been. Other countries aren't doing that, or most other countries aren't doing that. Here's a little website for the New Zealand COVID tracer, which is just basically an automated diary. So if you go to a restaurant and scan a QR code, you're not uploading to anybody else's database a record of where you were. You're simply making your own diary note for automated notification later. So I think we should be having a discussion about whether we should be doing that instead. The UK is doing the same thing, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Just such a reminder that it's not only about technology, but also about democracy, about public discussion, and this kind of the importance of thinking about these solutions to problems in a much wider way than technical. It also blows me away that we still don't know whether this thing works or not after having had such a bad second wave in Melbourne. I'll introduce our next speaker now, Graham Greenleaf, who is a professor of law and information systems at the University of New South Wales. He is also the founding co-director of the Australasian Legal Information Institute. Over to you, Graham.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation, Radhika, Tao, and Luke, and everyone at Deakin. I have some PowerPoints that I'm going to put up. Oh, no, that wasn't it. Sorry, I've got too many screens here to choose between. There we are, and I'm going to talk both about the COVIDSafe app and QR codes. Now, these are a long set of PowerPoints that'll be available from Deakin after the event today. So I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, and I'm going to compare these two technologies for contact tracing. Now, starting with the COVIDSafe app. Well, since the app's been available for just over 6 months now, and since the 14th of May, we've also had the legislation, the COVIDSafe Act, which is in fact part of the Privacy Act. So we're at the 6 month point almost. Now, during that period of time, after an initial rush of 6 million downloads in the first 6 weeks, it's now seems to have peaked at about 7 million downloads of the app. But there was a near elimination of COVID in Australia of the first wave before the app was even available. So it can take very little credit for Australia's relative success in combating COVID. In fact, the best statistics are that in this first 6 months of the app's use, it has assisted in identifying 17 contacts in New South Wales that might otherwise have been unknown, and no contacts in any other part of the country. So just apart from the technical problems that Vanessa has outlined, you would probably have to say that just in terms of effectiveness, it has not made any significant contribution to combating COVID in Australia. Now this will in a sense come to a crunch shortly, because by mid-November, the Commonwealth Minister for Health has to report on the effectiveness of the app to Parliament, and the Privacy Commissioner also has to make available a report on the operation of the Commissioner's functions under the Act. And there is, as I'll get to at the end of this, there is a sunset clause in the legislation that those reports will be relevant to as to whether the whole operation of the COVIDSafe app is to be shut down, to be terminated. But anyway, we'll get to that. My PowerPoints go through a fair bit of detail about how the app works. I'll just mention one thing relevant to what Vanessa said, that whenever two devices running the app come within Bluetooth signal range, that contact event is recorded. It's got nothing to do with the 1.5 metres for 15 minutes that ministers have parroted on about. In fact, as Vanessa was also saying, at some point, some algorithm somewhere, but we don't know the server code, so we don't really know how this works. There is some filtering of all that massive over collection of data down to what we could genuinely call proximity events, which of the contact events do indicate some relevant proximity of two people with the app on their phone. But basically, we don't know how that works, and that's one, I think, of the major lacks of transparency in how the whole thing operates. Now, a lot of people, like myself, took the approach, the strategy, that the best thing to do was to try and improve this legislation, given that 6 million people downloaded it in the first few weeks. It was pretty impossible to stop things in their tracks. So it was important to try and get the legislation as good as possible, and a reasonable success was achieved in doing that. And in fact, there is a great deal of voluntariness built into the COVIDSafe legislation that I've downloaded there, that I've put on that slide. There are many points at which people have to opt in if they're going to be involved in this, or have the opportunity to opt out, and so on, with the one major problem being that there is no regular purging of the contact data that is collected via the app on the National COVID Store database, the one that's on the Amazon server. So unless the whole thing is terminated at some point and it's all then destroyed, then an enormous amount, or certain amount anyway, of data that is just not necessary to be kept is continuing to be kept. I want to mention just a couple of things about the main dangers of surveillance systems and whether they're present here. The first is that even though there's a lot of voluntariness built into this legislation and the operation of the app, there was always a major danger that employers and schools and cafes, etc., would refuse people services in various ways unless you showed they had the app running. So voluntariness would turn into pseudo-voluntariness, in fact, pretty much compulsion. The Act addresses that. It has a whole lot of offences in it against requiring people to download the app, and all sorts of offences if you do things in employment contract, work conditions, etc., that effectively make use of the app compulsory, with significant criminal penalties. Well, that's good as far as it goes, but the question is, if they're offences, who's going to prosecute them? Who's going to prosecute major employer organisations and the like? So, at the last minute, the government actually listened to submissions on this and built in additional provisions that meant that individuals could take actions before the Privacy Commissioner, because any offence under the Act would also be a breach of the Privacy Act and open up actions for compensation. So as much as could be done legally to stop the app becoming de facto compulsory was in fact done, with a few little exceptions. And as far as I know, there is little to no evidence yet of breaches of those anti-coercion provisions. Now, this has never been seen in Australian legislation to do with privacy before. So that was a good development. The next danger is that of surveillance creep, that a system built for one thing would gradually become used for a whole lot of other things, like the data retention legislation is now being used by local councils and the like. So this COVIDSafe Act addressed that pretty thoroughly as well, by very strictly limiting the permitted uses of any COVID-safe COVID app data with pretty strong criminal penalties, and further having no exceptions built into the legislation. Both the police and the spooks lobbied for exceptions, and for once the government actually turned them down. And there are even provisions that the COVIDSafe legislation overrides other existing laws and future laws as well, unless they're very express in providing exceptions. So the normal danger of surveillance creep didn't seem to get built into this legislation. Then finally, the other thing we always worry about is that temporary surveillance systems, so-called, will turn out to be permanent. History suggests that surveillance systems are very rarely undone. Well, that was addressed here by various ways that people could opt out of the system, but with one big flaw, that the logs of contacts on the data store, the one on Amazon, stay there for the life of the whole system. There's no automated purging of data after it becomes useless, and there's no way that you can request or require contact data relevant to you to be deleted. So it therefore remains very important that the whole COVIDSafe system have a termination point, because you can't get all your data out of it while it's still alive. Now, that's in fact built in because the Minister for Health can determine under a section of the Act, the Sunset Clause section, that the Act is that the app is no longer required or effective, at which point the administrator of the system has to delete all the data, stop the app becoming available, and advise every existing user to delete the app off their phones. But it all depends on the minister making such a determination. And unfortunately, there's no way he can be forced to make such a determination by other parties. However, sometime in the next month, he has to report to Parliament on the effectiveness of the app, and who knows, it may be terminated. And the Privacy Commissioner has to make a report as well. But that's the big remaining question of whether, having proved its uselessness, the app will be terminated. Now, I would just sum all this up by saying that the app may have been a failure, but in many ways, the legislation is a success because we have not seen a piece of surveillance-related legislation in Australia that genuinely addresses the various problems of surveillance systems in as serious a fashion as this one does. So it may still be a valuable model for the future for how to constrain future surveillance systems that'll be built. Now, Radhika, if I can just I'm over my limit slightly now, but if I could just take 1 or 2 more minutes, I'd like to say a couple of things about QR codes to help us get that debate going as well. I just want to contrast what was done with the COVIDSafe app with what I'd call the laissez-faire neglect of any type of legal protections in relation to QR codes. I'd call what we're doing with QR codes in Australia outsourced compulsion. That it's state and territory governments here that make the collection of ID information compulsory by entertainment and other venues. But then those venues who are given that responsibility generally outsource the data collection and storage to QR providers, which, as Vanessa said, are a profusion of private providers and one government provider in some jurisdictions. There's no quality control over those QR providers in relation to the privacy protections they should provide. The venues that hire them have no strong incentive to enforce what they do with their privacy protections, and governments have abdicated from setting required standards for QR providers. And we as consumers are basically powerless. You either disclose or you don't eat or you don't get in, and you're forced to deal with and provide your personal data to QR providers who you have not chosen. We are really forced to deal with providers of services who we don't choose, but this is a case where we have to. Now, as customers, we can't realistically check where data is stored, what security it is it overseas, is it deleted with a minimum time? And we're usually required in the heat, while sitting down at a restaurant table, to agree with the privacy policy of the QR provider, which very probably allows disclosure to its so-called business partners and whatever they want to use your personal data for, and quite probably transfer overseas. And the data that you're providing is solid gold for data aggregators. Full name, email and phone number all together, linking the one person, sometimes even date of birth. So it allows both data matching and marketing back and the linking up of other fragmentary data that may be held, not to mention extreme malware dangers. So what can we do? State and territory governments can use their licensing powers over venues to impose quality standards. The private sector comes under the Privacy Act, or the QR providers, and the Commonwealth Privacy Commissioner could impose a code on QR providers, but that hasn't been done. Or we can insist on the pen and paper option and insist on just getting a piece of paper to write things down because there's less danger of misuse of that, except perhaps from the pen, bring your own pen. Or, as has been suggested, the New Zealand automated diary approach may well be a better approach. But we don't have any data as to whether that works either. It's not much point saying it's more privacy protective if it actually doesn't work. So we don't know. But where we end up now, the comparison, is that we've got a genuinely voluntary COVIDSafe app with Australia's strongest privacy protections, but it's now largely ignored because it's been shown to be ineffective. And in contrast, we have semi-compulsory QR codes, which have no effective privacy regulation, but looks like they're going to be here for quite a few years to come. So sorry to go over time, but I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graham. I think we've just become so used to accepting terms and conditions because we feel that if we don't, then we just can't get that. And so we're already kind of brought up on that. And a pandemic just kind of adds the other layer of, everyone's got to pull together and submit ourselves to this for the general good. And I think that makes things even harder. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Peter Mitchell. who is an associate professor at QUT Digital Media Research Center. Her research focuses on digital geographies, location awareness, mobile data, algorithmic culture, and network contagion. You're on next, Peter.
Great, thank you very much. Just bring up my slides. Okay, so thanks so much for having me here on this panel to speak to Monique's provocations on the COVIDSafe app from earlier in the year. What I'm aiming to do in my brief presentation here is bring somewhat of a specific spatial lens to this ongoing debate and discussion about contact tracing and surveillance. So I want to explain briefly first up how the research I currently do and have previously done speaks to this ongoing discussion. I'm currently leading a discovery project on digital media and location data, which is focused on the understanding and awareness of everyday location data sharing among digital media users and the particular or heightened privacy issues that arise from location sharing and location harvesting within the digital data economy. So I'm also involved in research with Monique that focuses on smart cities and technological or data sovereignty. And finally, I have a bit of a back catalogue and sort of research side hustle in the histories, genealogies and geographies of contagions, both medical and social, and also network or social media contagion. So in the era of COVID-19 and the ascendance of these contact tracing apps, many of my research interests have come into a kind of interesting alignment. And as a case in point, the history of contagion and contact tracing shows us really clearly that geography, geolocation and geodata have always been critical. So contact tracing as a form of data-driven epidemiology has a long history, and I'm sure this image of John Snow's map of the London cholera outbreak of 1854 will be familiar to a lot of people watching this, as it's both a classic example of geovisualization and a pioneering map that was instrumental in overturning the prevailing miasmatic theory of contagion at the time, and it went a long way to proving that cholera was waterborne and not airborne. Because it traced and tracked data collected from individuals, Snow's map is also considered to be an early example of and precursor to contemporary contact tracing. So given the importance of geolocation and geodata to contact tracing, it's unsurprising that smartphone apps almost immediately became a key response to the COVID-19 crisis, since we're all carrying these little geolocator sensors around with us. And because smartphones have the potential to harness that built-in GPS and thereby might rapidly speed up, if not automate, these more manual processes of contact tracing. So the first COVID-19 contact tracing apps that launched did expressly track location. So February 2020 saw the launch of South Korea's Corona 100 meters app, which harnessed a smartphone's GPS to alert the user when they came within 100 meters of a location where an infected person had been. In February also there was the initial pilot of Alibaba's health code in China, a mini app within its Alipay system, which also reportedly tracked location. In March, however, Singapore launched its national scale Trace Together app, as we know, which had used Bluetooth for proximity-based tracking rather than precise location-based tracking via GPS to encourage citizen adoption in the face of privacy concerns over GPS-based location tracking. In Australia, in April, Australia followed Singapore's lead and in some ways copied its app and launched the COVIDSafe app, it stressed in its campaign that COVIDSafe will not collect your location information. We've already heard about this in some of these previous talks today. So since the launch of the earliest apps in February and to date, around about 40 countries or so have released COVID-19 contact tracing apps, and using a range of technologies and approaches. So I've got a table here from a preprint paper by Stacey Hobson and co-authors, which shows that these tracing technologies can broadly be divided into GPS versus Bluetooth, with a small handful of apps that use QR codes. It's interesting that, if not misleading, that the GPS versus Bluetooth distinction is often presented as a simple distinction between location tracking on the one hand and non-location tracking on the other, as though Bluetooth cannot be used to track precise location in the way that GPS can and is. Certainly, Bluetooth-based contact tracing apps like TraceTogether and COVIDSafe register proximity between devices rather than explicit device location in the absence of fixed beacons from which granular location can be inferred. But of course, Bluetooth is a critical technology within the location economy, via which precise location data is regularly, if not constantly, harvested from smartphone users. This is why Apple has recently implemented iOS 13 Bluetooth permission alerts to match their GPS or location services ones, as Bluetooth has effectively become a kind of backdoor for surreptitious location tracking, as smartphone users have become more alert to GPS tracking through their smartphone operating systems alerting them to this. We know from multiple studies that people consider location as a specific data point to hold particular privacy sensitivities or heightened affect. So location sharing can make people feel more surveilled, but it can also make people feel more safe if they share it with a trusted contact, right? And it can make people feel both of these things at the same time. And we also know from these studies that despite the fact people consider location data to be especially sensitive, and despite the fact it might make them feel unsafe or surveilled, people are often willing to trade their location data for convenience. I mean, this is how Uber works, right? It's much more convenient to share our exact location. So I'd argue that nowhere has this increased value of and heightened sensitivities around location data been more apparent in recent years than in the varying approaches countries have taken to developing COVID-19 contact tracing apps, where countries such as Poland, South Korea, India, and Taiwan developed apps that expressly tracked the precise location of smartphones, spurring global debates over privacy and re-identifiability. Other apps such as Singapore's and Australia's and the contact tracing framework developed by Apple and Google stress their non-collection of location data as a critical component of their privacy protecting frameworks. That Australia and many other countries didn't even try, as far as I'm aware, didn't even try at the time to introduce location tracking apps suggests they knew they'd have an impossible sell trying to convince their citizenry to accept location tracking in the absence of anything resembling a convenience trade-off. The best we would have is altruism, right? I want to stress again how superficially appealing mass automated location tracking would have to be to epidemiologists and governments in terms of its potential for speeding up contact tracing and potentially shutting down emerging clusters more rapidly despite the privacy costs. But privacy concerns and mistrust over location tracking have been critical in the development of contact tracing apps. So indeed, the many and varied leaks associated with location tracking COVID-19 apps, like the few I've assembled here, suggest that citizen mistrust in location tracking is well-founded. In May, there were reports that the location data of citizens from Qatar and India were compromised by security flaws in their mandatory contact tracing apps. More recently, it was reported that a US college was mandating students use a leaky location-based app or risk being suspended or removed from campus. Another US-based contact tracing app, North Dakota's Care19 app, was even found to be sharing user location data with location intelligence platform Foursquare in violation of its own privacy policy. So this data is going out into the location economy, right? So where do we go with this? Australia's COVIDSafe app certainly doesn't track precise location, but this isn't to say that location tracking isn't in Australia's near pandemic future. Only last week, it was reported that Scott Morrison was calling for innovative solutions to hotel quarantine, including tracking apps and ankle bracelets that might allow the tens of thousands of stranded Australians to complete quarantine at home rather than in hotels. This might offer the convenience tipping point for citizens that has so far been missing from the national scale contact tracing apps. And similarly with the QR in recent days, the push for states to back QR code check-in systems. And these sorts of convenience-related initiatives might convince people to accept what geographers Jerome Dobson and Peter Fisher, even back in 2003, provocatively called geoslavery, real-time location control and bondage, a form of real-time location control and bondage that they described as extending far beyond privacy and surveillance. So on that somewhat dystopian note, I'll leave it there and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I think now we're all a little more scared. Without much ado, I'll introduce our last speaker on the panel, Luke Heemsbergen, who is a lecturer in communication at Deakin University, so is one of our own, and his main research interests are based in the digitally networked terrain of radical disability and democratic governing. You're on, Luke.
Thank you very much. I'll take radical visibility over radical disability for my research interests. But yeah, so I wanted to actually talk about this in terms of three kind of applied futures, or three kind of potentials that I've heard come through the discussions that everyone's been having so far. And I wanted to kind of speak to this in these apps in terms of infrastructure change. You know, the window we see on the screen, hopefully that you can see, shows that pandemics change our infrastructures. You can drive by Sydney Airport right now, or Melbourne Airport, to see how, you know, our infrastructures are changing as we speak. Of course, in the digital age, a lot of our infrastructures are these kind of ephemeral connections, right? The electronic infrastructures that allow us to do what we're able to do and go where we are able to go. And these are materializing through the COVID apps that we've been talking about. The title that I kind of the subtitle, I guess I gave our discussion when I organized, or tried to organize all of you. Tao, I think, organized all of us, so thank you, Tao. Had something about organized irresponsibility, which is taken from Beck, right? Or Beck talking about kind of late modernity and the new type of risks we encounter. I kind of was interested in what was happening through the apps that we were seeing, because it seems like there's a lot of organized irresponsibilities around where and to whom we place our trust, right? When there's kind of multiple valences of risk that we're talking about, there's privacy risks, there's health risks, right? That sometimes are competing. Then there's also multiple vectors that are trying to control or, you know, offer solutions, right, to these risks. And we can see this from the corporate side that we've talked about. And Graham, I think you brought up a lot of those problems, you know, quite eloquently in terms of the QR ecosystem that's evolving, versus, right, so we have corporate actors and we have the government centralization actors. So those are just kind of some of the things that were bringing me to think about. Oh, and then, I mean, we've all seen the news, sorry, right, that, you know, I can skip that when we've talked about it. But anyways, that kind of framework started me thinking about three kind of applied futures. If we take, you know, these ideas of centralization and decentralization to their ends, right? What are we looking at if there is in fact an app for that? And I'm borrowing here from a story that David Brin wrote, I think it was in 1999, about two cities that had pervasive surveillance, right? In one city, this transparency, this surveillance went up to the government. And in the other city, the surveillance went laterally, right, to citizens of it. So this is just kind of the guide that I was using when I started thinking about three applied futures, when we start thinking about what COVID apps can be, or how they possibly will be very useful or too useful to us in the future. So here's future number one: government knows all and gives all. When we take this idea of centralization and the privacy problems and the risk solutions that it entails, what does that look like when we kind of put it to its asymptote, right? Right now, the COVIDSafe app is good at giving a little bit of data to the government a lot of the time. Although if you want to know where a testing site is or anything else, you have to go to Twitter or watch Brett Sutton on the Age's website, or et cetera, right? The centralization is not complete. So if we think about, infrastructure that actually links these things together, maybe this is the kind of interface we get, right? Where similar to what we see in China, the ability to the ability to work, right? Your economic interaction with society, as well as your geographic interaction with society, is dictated through your device. And what my PhD student is just publishing a paper on this in Media International Australia. Fan Yang, so congratulations, watch for that paper. But here's just like one mock-up, right, of what this would look like. And it's integrated to such an extent that if you want your isolation payment, this is administered through the app, right? I mean, I just have some kind of tongue-in-cheek options that would be available in such a future. The second future that I think we should be thinking about is what we see happening, right? The endpoint of what's happening with this Apple Google move, which is actually moving these infrastructures away from government control, right? There's a much more libertarian sense of self-reliance and risk management that relies on what your colleagues are able to share with each other, decentralized from the government, yet facilitated through these corporate actors that until very recently have bent the rules, we'll say, of surveillance and privacy in ways that we're all familiar with, and now seem to be providing a much different set of services from which, we can manage our risk, right? So here's just kind of another idea in the sense that as we decentralize more and more, whether it be through the, not so much the New Zealand model, but this Apple Google model where you're only sharing information with each other when and so you choose to do so, that can help determine your risk profiles around how you live in a pandemic-filled world, right? And that's a different type of infrastructure, radically different than what we see in the first model. Now, I think the most radical model I'd like to propose here, though, is this third model. And this is a model that actually takes this giant kind of, I'll say it, quantum leap of surveillance that we're just going through. And instead of focusing it on individuals who, might carry a pathogen, we actually reflect this, searchlight of surveillance back on the government. And we ask questions about, what happens when the leading indicators of the pandemic in terms of how the government is controlling it, how it's helping us live our lives, is made public. What kind of incentives does that create, right? And how do you manage your life when you know very, very clearly what the government is capable of doing and how they're measuring up to protecting you and society, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of three far endpoints that I think take three different sets of political assumptions towards some of the issues that we've been talking about around privacy and health. But then I thought that these models needed some field work. So I had some glorious field work yesterday, the first possible day that I could. And here's some pictures of it, which allowed me to actually, sorry, I see the time, so I'll just finish up, which allowed me to actually, experience one of these QR code web-based apps, right, which I think we can talk about the security risks there, and come to the fourth model that I think public policy experts might be familiar with, which is muddling through, right? And this is this idea that in reality, there's going to be a somewhat broken and somewhat distributed system of incremental systems choices that various venues make, that various governments try to control, that basically have a limited set of information and you make a limited set of choices from that information as you move along. In layman's terms, there's heaps tons of apps for that. And these heaps tons of apps both help and hinder the various risks around health and privacy in ways that I think a lot of you have already spoken to, and maybe we can continue in discussion. Oh, and just as one, I know I'm over time, so I'll just say I had a really interesting conversation with a QR provider, a QR app provider, where I said, this is great that you're rolling this out in a Victorian state, and it looks like you're going to be rolling it out in another Victorian state. What do you think? How are you implementing privacy protocols? What are your security protocols? And the response was, we're not able to comment. So this is a very different answer than we saw the democratic process go through with the federal government, which was, in itself surprising. And I think that, it's something definitely we need to look to in the future. The company, sorry, last slide. The company, of course, that is providing this QR service, this is their background. So we need to know what they're interested in, why, and as I think Graham suggested, legislate. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. I don't envy Monique her task of moderating this discussion or providing a response to this discussion, because it's so rich and it's so widespread. So I'm excited to hear your response to this, Monique.
Okay, excellent. I'll just start there. Thanks, Radhika. Certainly do have a challenge ahead of me. First of all, I would just like to thank each of the panelists for their fantastic contributions to this topic in response to the initial talk that I gave earlier in the year when really this all first broke. In that talk, I tried to open up or challenge really this kind of idea of the privacy and transparency ideal, and also situate some of the developments we saw with the COVIDSafe app in the context of wider architectures of surveillance. And we see that through the more recent developments around QR codes, but also more broadly, a range of other surveillance developments we've seen, such as the use of automated number plate recognition tracking, the surveillance of sewerage, wastewater analysis, heat mapping in shopping centres, and so on. And I think very much this will remain with us for some time. Really, I think what it shows is, and I think each of the panelists spoke to this, the ongoing expansion and cementing of power by governments and also by big tech. And it demonstrates, in my view, that this is not only a public health crisis, but it is also an institutional crisis, a social crisis, a political and technological one as well, that not only requires, but demands an interdisciplinary response. And I think that's shown very much through the panelists and their various contributions from technical, legal, media and comms perspectives and so forth. I would emphasise, though, the notable absence on this panel of health experts. And I think that it's really important that we connect up and speak to people from the discipline of health, because this is a very complex socio-medical problem as well, I think. So basically, I think that was really borne out in the comments made by Jessica, Vanessa, and also Graham in relation to questioning the efficacy of the app for achieving its stated public health objectives in the context of this wider tension we often hear about between privacy or individual rights, security, public health, and other collective rights, which I would argue is not necessarily a zero-sum game. But it is very important, I think, that we do question, if this works, how it works, the importance of empirical data in order to make those evaluations. I think also it goes to show this focus on techno fixes and techno solutionism. And this relates to work that Peter and I, along with QUT colleagues, have recently put up on SSRN, and you can read it there. The kind of obsession with technology as solutions to problems, particularly in states of emergency and states of exception, and also within a wider context of techno-capitalism and also surveillance and also disaster capitalism. And I think this connects to the questions of normalisation of surveillance beyond. And I know Graham mentioned sunset clauses, but I think also from a social perspective, a normalisation that people will just accept or become comfortable with various forms of surveillance in their lives, this disciplining of subjects through forms of biopolitics, as Foucault perhaps would argue. But I also think we also need to question the division or the distinction we're making between centralised and decentralised approaches in all of this, and I think interrogate that a little bit more, and perhaps some of the oxymorons of big tech, GAPL, as Vanessa termed them, creating privacy preserving contact tracing applications where really the business models of these companies are very privacy invasive, and actually this is cementing their own infrastructural power as centralised providers of so many of our digital systems and services in private and public life as well. So that power of big tech, not only in the GACL model, the inverted commas, decentralized approach, but also Amazon in the centralized one as well. So I think that's something important that we need to think about and question. So in sum, thinking about solutions to problems, I think we need to problematize solutions and also to some extent problematize problems as well, and challenge these technocultural and techno-capitalist landscapes through interdisciplinary scholarship to advance not only public health, but also autonomy, privacy rights, view technology as not a fix or the solution, but also as quite often part of the problem itself. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique. That was masterfully kind of bringing all these ideas together and responding to them. And as you said, it is an interdisciplinary panel, and it requires an interdisciplinary panel. And perhaps, you know, we felt the absence of the medical, the discipline of medicine there. Just to start us off for the next few minutes, let's, you know, continue the discussion. One of the things that occurred to me was that with when it comes to things like apps and, you know, digital kind of interventions, most people don't have the expertise to know too much about it or to make choices and so on. And I think in this, you know, some of our panelists here are in that situation of being kind of citizen advocates or working on behalf, like expert citizens, you know, as opposed to lay citizens, expert citizens who are in fact able to turn the surveillance gaze back onto government, for example. You know, Vanessa, when your company goes and checks, you know, whether this is working and what exactly, whether, you know, to what extent, to Jessica, you know, the work that you do. I was just wondering about this, the creation of the citizen expert or the expert citizen, and how that might be changing, or this new role in kind of democratic, you know, democratic living, I suppose. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. So me or Vanessa?
You first.
Why don't you go first, Jessica?
Sure. So I think we've reached an age where there's too much information, right? There is information everywhere, and there is no single trusted source that you can go to. No newspaper, no deep down dig. You can't. We don't live in an age where people trust that what the government says is inside an app is what's there. And so the extension of that is a phenomenon of citizen interrogation and citizen, not so much journalism, but experts in their field coming forth and saying, well, based on the expertise that I've garnered, this is the information I can add to that debate. I think it's been absolutely critical. I mean, what we did was simple, right? We had a team that already worked together, and we said, this is a very private sector approach. Let's have a look at this. Let's tear it apart. There's another group that we did interface with a little bit, but that also did incredible things in the open source community, which is much more laudable, because herding an open source community is really quite difficult. And Vanessa, I guess I'll pass on to you to speak more about that, because you were much more heavily involved. But that team did incredible things, pulling this apart and trying to get that information across in a much more complex environment where you can't distill it as easily to one message. What do you think, Vanessa?
Yeah, I completely agree. And there were heaps of improvements, right? A whole lot of people who knew a whole lot of things about how Bluetooth worked and how iPhones worked and all kinds of things. They got improved by that process. So it wasn't just informing the citizens, it was fixing the thing. And I would like to say that it only works if there's a degree of transparency from government. Right? So people could fix the things that we could see, but we couldn't fix the server code. If you look across other kinds of government IT, right, there's limited hope of fixing digital ID. There's no hope of finding bugs in the Senate counting code. You know, this process that I think Radhika identified that is really important, and I would love to work, that not only informs citizens, but improves technology, only works if there's transparency from government about how the technology works.
But it's hard as well. I just double back into that because the communication back in is really difficult.
Yeah.
And when you have a disparate group of people with a lot of different views trying to interface with government all at the one time, it's really hard for government to deal with that and also get the job done, which is just an incredible challenge that I don't think there's a good answer for yet.
I agree. I think what I would like to see is much more open sourcing of work from the very beginning. One of the answers to the question that Graham Greenleaf posed yesterday evening about whether the GAPL-based apps are working was a video from someone in the Netherlands who was advocating this completely open, very citizen-driven kind of development process. Whereas what we saw with COVIDSafe was sort of the minimal lip service to that, right? They built it behind closed doors. They made a series of decisions without sharing that with the community in any way. And then they put out the app, and then they put out the code a few weeks later. And then a few months later, they finally put out the cryptographic specification. And at each of those points, we were really kind of patching stuff that had already been done. Whereas if they'd been much more open about the decisions they were making earlier, it might not have been as difficult as what we saw.
Thank you both. There are a couple of questions from the audience, and I'll do my best to read them out. And I'm not sure, you probably have to nominate who would like to answer that. The first question is, it seems that QR codes are proposed as a solution in the post-COVID era, but the non-digitality doesn't mean that technology doesn't facilitate more pervasive surveillance. Data are processed by different entities. Seems that there is no way to terminate pandemic surveillance. In fact, I think there was a lot of concern expressed by several panelists to say that this is not going to go away when the pandemic ends either, that the expansion is here to stay, and we'll just all become used to it, and the government will become used to surveilling us more. Who would like to comment on that?
So I'd like to jump in really quickly on that because other people have more ideas, but it's not possible to have a non-surveillance based contact tracing system. If we're going to say we're extending and augmenting contact tracing, then we have to accept that part of it is surveillance. If you've ever sat through a contact tracing interview, it is pervasive. It touches every part of your life. Who have you slept with? Where did you drink? Where did you walk? And that's for a really good reason. It is there to save lives. The real question that we need to be asking is, if we want to augment that capability, and if we do, is what we're doing actually going to make it more effective? Because if it's not, then we should stop it. And if it is, it's going to save lives. I'll pass off to the rest of the panel to chat on that.
I just to follow that through and respond to the questions, I think, it's interesting that the assumption there that, and this is just, pressing a point, the assumption there is that the government is involved in that augmentation. So we're talking about open source, we're talking about how the government would implement that. And I see trends going another way. The only COVID apps that are available to cross state boundaries are based on GAPL, which means that there's interoperability, to use the tech bro term, between not only phones but nations, right? Because for Apple and Google, it's just another it's an interop problem, right? So I think that when we ask, is this going to be effective and how is it going to be effective? Those different, just in the questions, the different ideas and norms, cultural norms, right, that exist across nations. Nation states and their governments aren't great at dealing with. And, Australia has a very unique cultural approach to government surveillance and data use that Canada does not. That is different than, the 14 different states that are using 12 different apps in America. So, when we think about it this way, the assumption of government centrality in fixing these problems around health and around privacy, I think itself is fraught. And I'm not advocating for that. I'm saying these are the trends that are being produced because of living in the pandemic. And I think we need to be very aware of that.
Can I follow up that what you just said, Luke, and ask Graham in particular about the differences between governments collecting and storing data and forgetting perhaps to purge the data when the need for that is done, and private companies. And earlier, there was a discussion on the data not going even to a centralized location, but distributed across different private companies, who in turn will then need to be surveilled or regulated in some way. And I don't know how effective that is. So should we be more comforted if the government collects data than private companies collecting data? And is that kind of, the border between public and private not as, obvious and solid as we might imagine?
Yeah, thanks, Radhika. Look, I think that can only be answered in generalities in a way, and the main point is that the dangers that come from private sector surveillance and public sector surveillance have some similarities, but are fundamentally different. In that, in the private sector, what you're dealing with is the way surveillance capitalism works, and therefore, there become very complicated questions about whether having a fairly radical dispersal of collection of data within the private sector gives you some slightly better protection than having the data only aggregated by a number of very large players, or perhaps in the end that may not end up making all that much difference either. But it is essentially the mechanisms of surveillance capitalism that you're worried about. Whereas with the state, there are a different set of factors, including the state's capacity to commandeer, either surreptitiously or through legislation, the data that has been collected by surveillance capitalism, as well as all of the state's wide range of mechanisms of compulsory collection that the private sector does not share. So we've got two different intersecting sets of dangers there, and I'm sorry that's not a very precise answer at all, but we have to be clear that while the dangers may be almost equal, the mechanisms by which surveillance is carried out and enforced are quite different.
I would I'll just add kind of two quick points to what Graham said, and I also very much agree with Graham. I think arguments that we are already surveilled by Facebook, Google, et cetera, then so what does it matter if the government surveil us? I think they're dangerous arguments to make, because we certainly shouldn't be thinking that the surveillance by private companies in the way that they operate is actually good. We should challenge that in addition to the government surveillance, but also that the private and public division between these forms of surveillance, various forms of surveillance, is not so clear. And I think the contact tracing applications very much show that as well.
There's another question in here from Fan Yang, and it's a version of a question that I was also itching to ask, but hoping to save for the last. And the question is, it says, it seems that people across different cultural specificities or different levels of digital literacies consider privacy differently, personal assets versus public good. The request is for a comment on how moral frameworks would navigate or fit in national, transnational, regional layers of surveillance. And I just want to add a little to that question. I was thinking as a migrant to Australia myself, this idea that, for example, voting is compulsory. I was going back to this notion of compulsory versus voluntary, and how we are quite happy with certain things being compulsory. For example, mask wearing, probably, vaccination, probably, the same people who might be pro-compulsory certain things might be very anti-compulsory, certain other things. And of course, there's this other thing about, giving up your data and not knowing what's going to be done with it. So your lack of privacy, which is a different danger to opening yourself up to kind of cyber attacks because you have clicked on something or your data is somewhere that can, come back and attack your device kind of thing. So I think everybody on the panel will have views on this, and maybe we can start probably with Peter in response to these broad questions.
Yeah, in research that Monique and I have previously done about sort of smart cities and data sharing, I mean, we looked at how the simple fact of being a citizen requires a kind of transaction of personal information. Like to be identified as a citizen, you have to give away some kind of personal information. It's part of that exchange. And so, we are used to kind of giving away certain parts of our data, and where we draw that line is certainly quite a personal one, and it relates to as the question put, that kind of digital and digital literacies and privacy literacies as well. And so what's been interesting to see play out, I think, in some of these debates over contact tracing apps is where people seem to be more willing to put their trust in transnational, the Google Apple framework than they might into their own government. And it's interesting seeing these kinds of at that kind of nation state level, this sort of lack of trust play out. But there have been interesting cases around the world, say, thinking about location tracking. One of the app that I believe had the highest public uptake was Iceland's percentage of public uptake was Iceland's app, which was a GPS tracking app. It wasn't particularly more effective than others in doing anything, but you've got these different kinds of levels of trust. But even in another high trust society, like what's considered to be a high trust society like Singapore, I believe they only had about 25% public uptake. So I think these are interesting kinds of questions we can ask about cultural aspects of trust.
The trust thing is fascinating for me. Just one really quick comment, and that to me it reminds me of VPNs, right? So like, I trust my government and Telstra to retain all my data because I have to, or I trust like a nameless entity that exists in a numbered account in Luxembourg to do the same. And it's like that's a right that how it's a form of like sub-politics of how you're envisioning your relations of trust around your own data. It's crazy.
But look, I actually want to press it a little further. Actually, I was fascinated by your take on it through infrastructures, and some of these things are actually infrastructured in. Some of the, they're baked into the infrastructure, the choices that we have and the options that are available to us. And I wondered whether, what kind of infrastructures the pandemic has brought about, technological infrastructures that are, that will take away choice from, we won't even know. And the whole point of a well-running infrastructure is invisible. It doesn't intrude in any way, and we don't notice it. That's the sign of a good infrastructure. So we might be using or we might be operating in a way that we're not aware that we're operating.
So I think we don't know yet because we can see these things, right? Like QR code, what is that? COVIDSafe, only 6 out of 30 million have downloaded it. Once we can't see it, then we know it's there. So I don't think we know yet what these infrastructures will be, but we're getting hints, and I think they're still malleable in terms of where we can take them, right? What becomes infrastructure, and I think that's the important discussion we're having.
So, Jessica, you opened up the black box of COVIDSafe, and Vanessa, you did further work on that as well. I'm wondering, from both from the infrastructural perspective, which you'd have a very good idea of the technological infrastructure part, but also more generally the question about the kind of cultural and probably personal, generational, attitudes that we have towards privacy, towards some of the issues that came up in terms of, the willingness to be surveilled, the sense of, we need to do this for the general good, etc. Sorry, it's a big confusion of questions, but
I was going to say I could finally write a thesis on this topic. So I think there's a couple of things that we should keep in mind here. One is when we talk about trust differences between the government and the Apple-Google approach or the GAPL approach, they are fundamentally different. One is a decentralized approach that uses the edge of Bluetooth technology in Bluetooth and Apple phones or Google and Apple phones that both companies refuse to allow access to nation states for, which is a whole nother debate that we should get into at some point about when a multinational can turn around as a utility, and that is essentially what they are, can turn around and say, you know what, democratically elected government, we're not going to do this thing to help you save the lives of your people. Whether it's the right or wrong thing is probably irrelevant to that debate. There is more trust in a decentralized system. It does allow for people to at least not have to think about their data being collected. It's also true that a lot of Western societies are low trust when it comes to government. We are much faster to attack government on things that most corporations will get away with easily. In fact, one of Luke's last slides is a perfect example of this, right? We have spent, I don't know, countless hundreds of hours critiquing COVIDSafe and its application inside Australia for the last 6 months. But these QR code companies that are coming out now are outsourced risk for that, right? They're outsourced data collection risk, they're outsourced everything. And there isn't a great deal of scrutiny going on around where they're collecting that data, where it goes. Even when we talk about disparate commercial data, so multiple small companies, you can almost think of data collection in derivatives, right? So it's disparate in this first thing, but then you drop down a layer and there's a data aggregator that will happily buy all of that from you and come to someone like me with a really nice price per user. So I think trust is low in governments. There is definitely a generational trust shift. The younger generation has seen the morphing of politics to the point where there is less trust now, and that's most of what they've known. But there's also this issue of what is available to governments to be able to build on. I know that we're going to run short on time. I could probably wax and wane on this for another 10 minutes, but I'm very keen that Vanessa has probably different ideas on this to me. So Vanessa, what do you think?
We talked about this last night, which was actually really, really interesting. So I think to a large extent, I agree, but I don't entirely agree. So first of all, as Monique said, there are big tech companies on both sides of this discussion, right? So on the one hand, there's Apple and Google on the presenting their exposure notification API. On the other hand, there's Amazon with this massive database of COVIDSafe data. So unfortunately, sadly, each of these things represents a significant opportunity for power for large unaccountable tech companies. So I don't like the idea that multinational tech is pushing around a democratically elected government either. Although I do think that in this specific case, it just happens that the thing that the tech multinationals are pushing is better for the empowerment of ordinary citizens than the thing that the democratically elected government wanted to do. So there's a kind of rich irony here for a person like me who loves democracy, that the thing that has been decided in a way that I agree is quite inappropriate and effectively being coerced onto the democratically elected government by an unaccountable external power is actually a lot better for the ordinary citizen than the thing that the democratically elected government wanted to do. So I think that the right solution is for our government to behave in a more democratic manner. So democracy is not only the system in which you have an election every 4 years and the 51% runs rampant for the intervening periods. If you look at other countries, the UK, the Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, they have made this decision in a much more democratic way than Australia did. We didn't have a really good democratic discussion in the beginning about whether we were going to have centralised data or decentralised data gathering. And we aren't really still having a democratic analysis of it now, like the UK did before they decided to switch. So we could talk about this all day, and I will shut up. But I completely agree with the point you made at the very beginning, which is there should be a lot more focus on companies like this Arden Street Labs people, and the idea that you can just blow somebody off by saying, oh, we're not going to tell you our privacy policy. That's outrageous. And I completely agree. We should be interrogating them at least as much as government.
Yeah, if I've got 2 seconds to add on to that, because I'd actually like to get Graham's input on this. We have an infrastructure problem around the tech for dealing with COVIDSafe, and we have a trust problem, but more than anything in Australia, what we need are stronger data laws overall.
Yes.
So not just how do we handle this in a pandemic, but how do we make sure that someone like Arden Street Labs that is collecting data as a private organisation is correctly regulated?
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of people in tech that would build better tools for what we need in the next 10 and 20 years if we had more robust regulation to be able to rely on to make sure that that data wouldn't be misused. So Graham, do you have, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes to be able to give insight?
Yeah. A very, very quick response from Graham, because we have a couple of great questions that we will wrap up with, and we're nearly out of time. So very quick.
Sorry,
response.
Radhika.
Please unmute yourself, Graham.
The quick response is that where governments are making collection of personal data compulsory, as in the QR instance, they have to also accept the responsibility for properly regulating those organisations to whom they outsource that task, such as QR providers like Arden Labs, and make sure that the privacy aspects of it are genuinely properly controlled, because individuals can't do it, and you can't just rely upon a complaint mechanism to the Privacy Commissioner. You need to go in there and ensure that privacy by design and by default is the way it's dealt with, not after the event responses in relation to complaints. More could say, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Graham. There's a question from Tao, and she asks, in the context of continued vilification of migrant communities for COVID non-compliance, what steps might government, etc., take to earn trust from specific communities? The conversation is often about language and miscommunication, but that's not the whole story when it comes to why certain communities do not or are unable to comply. And a follow-up question to that is, how can we design technologies so that they help engender trust in diverse communities? So this will have to be the final question. So we have only 2 minutes. So can I invite Monique to start with to provide a quick response, and then everybody give a very short 1 or 2 sentence responses, please.
Certainly, it's an excellent question by Tao, and we've seen here, particularly Victoria, the enforcement of restrictions or lockdowns in a punitive way that targets certain groups or perhaps not, and really raising these big important issues of social and also data justice in this. Coincidentally, relating to work that Peter and I have just recently published on technological sovereignty, about the ways in which we can empower individuals and also diverse communities in not only the design, but also the use of technology as well for their own ends. And so I would just refer interested readers to that recent publication. We look at this in relation to the Sidewalk Labs saga that we saw in Canada, and also contrast this to other models of approaches to data collection and use, in particular what the Barcelona city is doing. And so I think that there are measures that we can empower communities through technology, but not only through technology as well. And again, this importance of the socio-political context, the cultural context, the dimensions, and the interdisciplinarity between social scientists and technologists, which is really the aim of the Science and Society Network. So I'll leave it at that.
Since we are in fact at 11:30, I think we can continue the discussion via a blog. Let me just finish by thanking Jessica, Vanessa, Peter, Graham, and Luke for an excellent discussion, and Monique for your kind of supernatural ability to kind of bring such a diverse discussion together and put a kind of a meta layer above it that kind of knits all this complexity together into bigger questions. There's so much, so much amazing work that's going on, and so much that needs to keep going on. Again, I thank you very much, and I hope we keep the discussion going. Thank you also to our audience that has joined on YouTube, and a very big thank you to Tao for putting such a great group together. Thank you again on behalf of SSN and Deakin. Thank you very much.